Hello, everyone. I'm Patsy Palmer, board member and docent at Holocaust Museum, Los Angeles. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Ettie Sidrer Zilber's book talk, As Mama Told Us. At the end of the event, I will announce the 3 lucky registrants who have won a copy of her wonderful book. For now, I'll tell you a bit about the museum. Holocaust Museum Los Angeles is the first Holocaust museum in the United States founded by survivors in 1961. They wanted to create a safe place to display their precious artifacts in perpetuity and to remember their family members and loved ones who had perished. Today, the museum continues to provide free Holocaust education to students and visitors from across Los Angeles, the United States, and the world, fulfilling the mission of our founding survivors to commemorate, educate, and inspire. Holocaust Museum Los Angeles brings you programs like today's at no charge. If you're enjoying our programs, we ask that you consider supporting our work by going to holocaustmuseumla.org to make a donation. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Ettie. Born in a displaced persons camp in Germany after World War II, Ettie immigrated with her parents to the USA. She grew up and was educated in New York City and Pennsylvania and moved to Israel after completing graduate school. After retiring from a career in international schools in 6 countries, she currently resides in Arizona with her husband. She is a board member for the Phoenix Holocaust Association and devotes much time to giving presentations to youth and adults worldwide. Welcome, Ettie.
Thank you, Patsy. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I've got my screen here. It's always very special for me to give presentations, and I really love to see people's faces, but I'll have to get over it. Okay. I'd like to introduce you to Mama, because I'm telling you the story as Mama told us. And this is Mama telling her story to them, and them being high school students in Israel in an international school there. She only started telling her story late in life, but she felt that it was really, really important to tell it and that the younger generation know what happened. And she also became active in the Lithuanian Association in Israel. And here she was part of the organizing committee, and she's giving a speech commemorating the 50th anniversary of liberation. And Mom got very, very involved in this work. But unfortunately, Mama's no longer with us. And so you've got me, and I will continue her work. I've committed, at this point in my life, I've been able to commit to educating about the Holocaust. For me, it was very, very important to educate my children and my grandchildren. I wanted them to know where they came from. And expanding that, I want audiences, youth as well as adults, to know about the Holocaust so that it isn't forgotten. The statistics from recent surveys are indicating that it is being forgotten. And I don't think we should ever forget genocides of any sort. And we know very well how anti-Semitism and racism has never ended and actually are worse in these last years. I've also committed to, in my way, denying the deniers and the distorters of the Holocaust. For me, this is another one of my commitments. And in Spanish, we say, I'm offering mi grano de arena, my little grain of sand, to the documentation and awareness about the Holocaust. So eventually I wrote a book, and I had no intention of writing a book to start with, but it sort of took on a life of its own. And my book is pretty much a double memoir. It's Mama's story after we finally convinced her to record her story. In her earlier years, she never wanted to speak publicly. She didn't want to record like many other survivors did her stories with the Shoah Foundation. And so we sort of cornered her and said, listen, your grandchildren need to know. As soon as she heard that, she said, okay, I'll do it. So we recorded her, I transcribed it, and then went on a bit of a tour in her footsteps. And I'll tell you more about that. As Patsy mentioned, I am a board member of the Phoenix Holocaust Association, and I'm proud to say that we just recently helped institute a state mandate for Holocaust education. And we're very, very proud of that. And now we're in the process of helping train teachers, getting resources for the teachers to embark on this new responsibility. But we're very pleased that we're one of, I believe, 14 states in the United States that have a Holocaust mandate. Typically, teaching about the Holocaust, sometimes people focus on the numbers. And I think that this is not the way to educate about the Holocaust. The most important way to educate about the Holocaust is through personal stories, individual stories. The numbers are just so mind-boggling. Neither youth nor adults can get their heads around the enormity of the numbers. So the most important thing is to talk about individuals, what happened to people, their families. And that's why it's so important to have the testimonies of survivors. Unfortunately, time is taking its toll, and many survivors are no longer with us. And so as a second generation, many of us have taken up the gauntlet and are speaking about our parents' experiences. And even third generation are doing that now as well. So, so we're ensuring that the story is not forgotten. So let me introduce you to my family. This is my mother's mother, Etta, for whom I'm named. And this is my grandfather, Yakov Santocki, and I always mention their names so that they will not be forgotten. And if you notice, this photo is all wrinkled, and that has a story behind it. The entire concept of photographs for survivors and their descendants, photographs are holy grail. The majority of survivors never even had one photograph after the war. And our family has been fortunate, and I'll tell you why and how we managed to secure dozens and dozens of photos, pre-war photos. And this was one of them. And
Ettie, I'm sorry for interrupting, but we can't see your screen.
Really?
Yeah.
All right, so let's go back. I guess I got disconnected. Hold on. Let me share my screen again. I wish I knew earlier. Okay. I guess I was disconnected from the, how about now?
Yeah, we can see it. Yeah.
You got it?
Yes.
All right, so I'll back up just to show some of those photos that you didn't see. That's Mama speaking to the 50th commemoration, my commitments, okay, and on we go. Okay, so the reason that this photo is wrinkled is that it was hidden during the war by my grandmother's neighbor. My grandmother was a very clever woman, and she obviously realized that they don't have a very good future. And so she took a bunch of photographs and gave them to a neighbor and asked her to save them for her. The neighbor was afraid to be caught with these photos, so she hid them in one of the straw mattresses and that's why they are wrinkled. And my mother, she gave them back to my mother after my mother came back to their town of Kovno, Kaunas, Lithuania. This is a photo also, as you can see, it was touched up. It was another one of those photos hidden in the mattress. And as soon as my mother could, she had a professional touch it up. This is my mother, Zlata Santocki. This is her next youngest sister, Ida. Then her sister, Nechama, and the little sister, Genya, and my grandmother, Etta, and Yanko. This was just before the Russians came in. I'm expanding on the family because now you can also see my great-grandmother, Esther Liebe Disner was her maiden name, Zivov, she married Zivov. I also do genealogy. So if there's anybody in the audience that recognizes these names, I would love to chat with you. And this was a photo most likely from 1933. And one of my favorite photos, and you don't see them typically because most photos were studio photos. This was an outdoor photo at the orchard where my grandfather, Gershon Zivov, worked. And you see a lovely sunny day family photo. And now I'm showing you my grandmother's siblings. And this is another reason why we have so many photos. One of the siblings that's missing from the photo is Carl, who immigrated to the United States around 1922. But this is her sister, Mina, who immigrated to Cuba and then to Southern Rhodesia at the time. This is the brother, Moshe, who immigrated to Uruguay. And this is Uriel, who stayed in Lithuania, and I'll tell you more about him. So we had family in many other countries, and so did my father's family. So this is my father and his little sister, Riva, who unfortunately, she's alive, but she unfortunately just had a stroke, and she's trying to recuperate in Israel. My grandfather, Feivel, and my grandmother, Chaicha. Sidrer was the family name. And they came from, Feivel and Chaicha came from Grodno, which is now Belarus. And this was their family. And this is my grandmother, Chaicha. And her siblings immigrated to South Africa, to Uruguay, to Argentina. And so they were not in Europe during the war years. And their name was Kamionski from Grodno. This is an outdoor photo of Chaicha and Feivel and my father and his little sister walking on the beautiful boulevard of Kovno, the Leisfusalea. And it's lovely. And this one I love as well. This is my father on the back of a motorcycle. My father was always, always fascinated by anything mechanical and electronic. And those skills kept him alive during the war. I'll tell you more about it. So let me start with the history. Just 80 years ago in Kovno, it was just 80 years ago when the Soviets came into Lithuania. As you know, the Nazis and the Soviets made a pact, and they divided Europe. You take this side, we'll take that side, and we'll be good friends. Well, that lasted just about a year. And I won't go into the details of that year in Lithuania. Suffice it to say that the Lithuanians did encourage the myth that the Jews were responsible for the occupation. They encouraged the occupation. They were happy about the occupation, and that certainly didn't bode well for the Jews amongst the Lithuanians. After 1 year, during that time, sorry, the Soviets nationalized all the properties, and indeed my grandfather's factory was nationalized, as were many other businesses and properties. and many of the owners were deported to Siberia, Lithuanian as well as Jews. My grandfather was on the list to be deported. Somehow they were never deported. And in these cases, you never know whether it's luckily they weren't deported or unfortunately they weren't deported, because my uncle, my grandmother's brother, was deported to Siberia. His family was murdered in Kalvaria, but he survived in Siberia. So these situations, you never know whether it was fortunately or unfortunately. Mom starts the story of the German occupation of Lithuania with her memory of the bombing of the airport outside of Kovno. She was 16, and as she tells it, she was coming home from a date with her boyfriend, and this was the beginning of the occupation. They attacked the airport, and my mother's family took the decision to try to escape. My grandmother packed a bag of dried bread. Evidently, she had expected some kind of problems. But in parallel, my father's family, and they were both from the same city, they chose not to try to escape. My paternal grandmother was not a well woman, and they decided to stay home. So my mother's family set out on foot, trying to get to Russia, optimistically, right? Unfortunately, on the way, they were stopped. They were arrested. There were thousands and tens of thousands of people, including the Russians themselves, who were making their way back to Russia, or trying to. But unfortunately, they were stopped by the Germans, who were already there, and they were arrested, and they were sent to a place called the Seventh Fort. The city of Kaunas has a ring around it of 9 forts, and this was one of them, the Seventh Fort. They were taken up to the Seventh Fort. These are tens of thousands of people. The women and children were sent to stay inside in these barracks in the fort, and the men were separated and they were outside. And the objective here was to murder all the men. And my mother describes hearing all the gunshots. She describes the seeing the rows of men walking by the barracks. And that day, or those few days, 5,000 men, women were also raped and killed there as well. These are photos of that period of time with the men lining up outside the fort, and they were taken in smaller groups, and they had to dig large pits, and they were told to undress, and they were shot, and they fell into the pits. And this was the common practice in all of Eastern Europe, actually. These are photos I took when I visited the Seventh Fort. It was very, how shall I say, uncomfortable walking around in the beautiful green grass, knowing what lay underneath it. This aerial photo of the Seventh Fort gives you an idea of the size. And if I were cynical, I would say, gee, I wonder why it's so green. Unfortunately, I just learned that the Seventh Fort was sold off to a private entrepreneur, and now it's being used for rock concerts, weddings, summer camps, and this is the fate of that place that holds the bodies of our family members. Eventually, the women and children were let go. It's a long story, but they made their way home. And this photo, I think, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure that it is my mother's home. And they changed the numbers after the war of the buildings. So the number that on the street that she gave me was slightly off, but an old map, a pre-war map, indicated that this was most likely their home. And they made their way back home. And they settled back into the house, and they had to figure out, how are we going to survive now? They were sure that Papa, my grandfather, was dead. That was almost a given. And then one day, Grandpa appeared in the doorway with 2 Gestapo men with him. And needless to say, they were thrilled to see that he was alive. And he told them the story of what happened to him at the 7th Fort. He was also participating in digging the graves, digging the pits. He was told to undress. And as he was about to take off his boots, he pulled this medal out of his pocket. And he said to the Lithuanian with the gun, he said, I want you to know you're about to kill a Savanaris. What's a Savanaris? A Savanaris in Lithuanian means a volunteer. And there were many Lithuanian citizens who volunteered to fight in the wars of independence in 1918. And my grandfather was one of them. And for this, they received a medal. And the photo you're looking at is the medal that I now have in my possession, because when I went to Lithuania, I found an antique dealer, and I asked him if he had this medal, and he did, and I bought it from him. And so now we have that medal at home. I don't know if it's Zeta's medal, but nevertheless, it tells a very interesting story. And I've written some articles, published some articles about it. Well, the Lithuanians saw the medal, and he took him out of the lineup to be killed. He sent him instead to the Gestapo prison, which actually saved his life. So that's the story of how my grandfather survived this time. Needless to say, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the anti-Jewish laws that were enacted in any city where any country that the Nazis came into. And Kovno was no exception. And of course, the yellow star is a familiar icon for us. And of course, the mandate to relocate to the ghetto. 30,000 Jews from Kovno were now being forced to relocate into the poorest area across the river, a town that the Jews called Slabotka, but in Lithuanian, it was Vilijampolė. And that was a space that housed 7,000 people beforehand. So you can imagine that the living conditions were awful. I'm going to show you a series of photos just to give you an impression of what life was like from that moment on. This is a photo of how the Jews were now moving themselves into the ghetto. It was chaotic, it was difficult, it was frightening. And these are some photos. I'll tell you where they come from in a bit. And you see people moving. This is now in winter, and so it was a second movement. There were many movements within the ghetto. This is a typical ghetto street, wooden houses. Almost everyone was made of wood. And these photos are what we have now to show us what life was like in the ghetto. But to tell you what life was like, it was a horrible, horrible experience. It was a prison. It was barbed wire. There were armed guards. There were decrees all the time. Disease, hunger, deprivation, all the time. In the ghetto, there was an organization, a Judenrat, Eldesrat, sort of the the intermediaries between the Nazis and the population. There were definitely many community activities, and there were resistance activities as well. But above all, there was hunger, deprivation, there was no sanitation, and frequent akcijas, as they called them. These were roundups. And an akcja always meant bad news. This is just a drawing. This drawing was done by Josef Schlesinger, showing you people who didn't find a place to live in the ghetto, and they literally lived on the street. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the archives and what remained afterwards to document what happened in the ghetto. Many of you might be familiar with the Ringenblum archives from the Warsaw Ghetto. Well, in Kovno, there was also an attempt to collect information and to bury it so that afterwards the world would know what happened to them in real time. It was much smaller than the Ringelblum effort for sure, but there was an effort in Kovno Ghetto to document what was going on for future generations. The ghetto had a small ghetto attached to it by this little bridge. So there were actually, it was the big ghetto and the little ghetto. And there was this bridge, and this is a drawing by the artist Esther Lurie. She was a prisoner in the ghetto as well. She was an artist, and she was encouraged to draw what she saw for the archive. And she did. Some of her work survived the war. Other pieces she recreated after the war. There was a little medical clinic in the small ghetto, and in that clinic, it was more for contagious diseases. And the ghetto had doctors and nurses who took care of the patients. One day there was an akcja where the Germans came, locked the hospital, the clinic, and burned it down with the doctors and the patients and the nurses inside. And this is Esther Lurie's rendition of the burned out hospital. The big akcja that is commemorated very often in the Lithuanian Association took place in October of 41. They moved into the ghetto in August. So this is all taking place in the subsequent months. And so in the big akcja, everybody was told to line up in the big square, and there was the selection, right, left, right, left. That day, almost 10,000 Jews were taken out of the ghetto. Among them, my great-grandmother, the one you saw in the photo, Esther Libedizna Zivov, they were all sent to the 9th fort, a different fort. Now in these drawings, you can see the road up to the 9th fort. This is the ghetto, and the 9th fort was just above the ghetto. And this is Esther Lurie's rendering of the road to the 9th fort. And this drawing on the left, my grandfather drew from memory after the war. And if you look closely, you can see all the people walking up the hill. This is etched in every single Kovno survivor's memory, that day of the big akcja. And the 9th fort was enormous, and it was up on the hill, and the same format. Everybody was brought up there. The pits were already dug. They had to undress, and they were shot and thrown into the pits. This is an aerial view of the 9th fort. You can see that it's a very, very large space. And many of our family members are buried here. This became a killing field for Jews, not only from Lithuania, but also from the far field as France. And there's evidence that shows that Jews from all over Europe were sent to the Ninth Fort to be murdered. They estimate almost 50,000 in total were murdered here in the Ninth Fort. We have firsthand testimony of what took place up there because a good friend of my parents was a prisoner in the Ninth Fort, and he was a Sonderkommando. And the Sonderkommandos were forced to dig up the bodies when the Germans saw that the war was not going in their direction, as they say. They decided to start eliminating evidence, and they had the Sonderkommando dig up the bodies and burn them on funeral pyres. And he survived, and he gave testimony of what he saw at the Ninth Fort. More information about what's now come to be known as the Holocaust by bullets is available in these books and also on the website of Yachad im Unum. This is the organization that was founded by Father Patrick Dubois, a Jesuit priest. The Phoenix Holocaust Association brought this exhibit to Phoenix last year, or the beginning of this year, and thousands of students and adults as well visited the exhibit. And the detail that, of his research is beyond belief, quite frankly. So if the history of the Eastern European Holocaust is of interest, I highly recommend that you read these two books. This is a photo of auctioning of Jewish property. When Jews were killed, their homes were taken over, and the clothing that they left behind, all their personal possessions, were given away, auctioned off, and this was part of the process. Inside the ghetto, there were soup kitchens. There was a school for a short time until they were afraid to continue because all of this is forbidden. This is a photo. I believe that you might have a similar photo in the Los Angeles Museum of the movement, one of the aktsias sending a group of Jews to Estonia to a labor camp. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about all of these photos that we have. And those photos are thanks to a man now called George Kaddish, Tzvi Kadushin. And he, of course, it was illegal to keep radios or cameras, but he kept a camera and he hid it in his shirt. And through the buttonhole, he set up his aperture, and he went around the ghetto clandestinely, taking photos of everyday life in the ghetto. And thanks to his photos, we have a picture of what took place in the ghetto. And the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington held a big exhibit about the history of the Kovno ghetto. And this is the catalog from that exhibit. And perusing this catalog one day after visiting the exhibit, my mother saw this photo and she was shocked. This is my father's father, Feivel. And this is the only photo we have of him in the ghetto. And you can see he's wearing the yellow star and he's standing outside a sawmill. And they're sort of posing. So I'm assuming that, that they knew they were having their photo taken. But this was the only photo inside the ghetto that we have. Obviously, outside the ghetto, there were partisans in the forests outside. My family was not involved in the partisans on the outside, but my father was very much involved in fixing all the guns, the old crummy guns that they got, to make them functional. And so he would then send them back out to the partisans. These are renderings of the ghetto gate, and you'll see a lot of the photos about the ghetto gate. This is the entrance and the exit, and this is where the large groups would go to work. The most important thing in the ghetto was trying to get work, because if you got work, you might get a bowl of soup. Well, wasn't exactly a bowl of soup. These are renderings of the large numbers setting out for their work at the airport, the aerodrome, as my mother calls it, because the thousands of ghetto inmates got job working at the aerodrome. They had to walk about 10 miles out and 10 miles back. And my mother worked at the aerodrome, and the work was quite difficult. This is a photo of that lineup at the aerodrome. And I can't find my cursor for some reason. Here we go. Okay, more lineups. This is just giving you an idea. Now, the ghetto Judenrat, they convinced the Germans that it was in their interest to set up workshops. And this actually saved a lot of Jews. They set up all different kinds of workshops. And of course, the military and the population around benefited from it. And the people who were working in the workshops also. And so my mother and my grandfather and my father acquired work in the workshops. And this was pretty much a lifesaver because it was indoor work, not outdoor work. This is a leather workshop. And then, of course, as you can imagine, there were many orphans. And this is a photo of the orphanage. The situation for children in the ghetto was terrible. And you can see some of the children were on the street. And this is a photo of young kids. And you can see the older brother is taking care of the younger sibling on the street. And thanks to George Kaddish, Tzvi Kadushin, we have these photos. None of them survived. And in March of 1944, there was another aktia, and they came in with trucks. They locked the ghetto. They came in with the trucks, and they took away all the children, the old people, and infirm. And that was called the Kinderaktie. And any child under 12 years old, or seemingly under 12 years old, was taken in very brutal fashion. And needless to say, the morale in the ghetto after the Kinderaktie was horrific. So what did my parents do? Meanwhile, my parents met in the ghetto and fell in love in the ghetto, which goes to show you that even under dire circumstances, human beings look for love. They fell in love, and after the Kinderaktie, they decided, you know what, we want to get married. We don't know if we're going to survive. They knew that the end of the war is coming, and they decided to get married. Now, it was forbidden to get married in the ghetto. It was forbidden to get pregnant. It was forbidden to have a child, everything under pain of death. But they decided to do it anyway. And if I have time at the end, I'll tell you more about how they conducted the wedding with a rabbi, believe it or not. Of course, everybody thought they were crazy, but that's a different story. And right after that, right after they got married, a few weeks later, my father came to my mother and said, listen, I have an opportunity to escape. And she said, geh und komm nicht zurück. Don't come back. And I'll tell you, if we have time, I'll tell you more about my father's escape from the ghetto. But that was, that has become almost a family joke. You know, they got married, and then 2 weeks later, he came and told her, okay, Zlata, I'm leaving. But one thing I'm grateful for is the humor in my family. And that was a wonderful thing for us. So my father escaped from the ghetto. But meanwhile, the rest of the ghetto were preparing what they called malinas, hideouts, because they knew the Russians were close, they were closing in. And they figured that as long as they could hold out and hide out, then they would be liberated by the Russians and they might survive. And so most houses tried to set up a malina, but as you can see, most of the houses were made of wood. And they didn't realize that the Nazis would just burn and bomb the place to pieces, because they knew that the Jews were hiding in different hiding places in the ghetto. And so indeed, they burned down the ghetto, and anybody who was still hiding was burned to death. And that's where one of my mother's sisters was killed. She was hiding in a malina with her boyfriend, and they were burned to death. My mother was also hiding, but the smoke got so bad, they decided, well, let's get out of here. Whatever happens, happens. And so they got out of the malina, and of course, they were arrested. But this is what the ghetto looked like after the liquidation. And this is what the survivors who were out in hiding, and this is what my father saw, because he did manage to escape and survive the escape, and that's what he saw when he was hiding across the river. So if I had to imagine what it was like to be taken from the ghetto, this is a photo of the Warsaw Ghetto. And I would imagine that coming out of the Kovno Ghetto was something similar. And of course, they were taken to the trains. And the trains meant only one thing. The women were sent to Stutthof Concentration Camp. And this is Stutthof, and Mama describes it very well. These are the registration forms that I collected after the war, after my visit to Stutthof. And it's the registration of my mother, her mother, my grandmother, and the two younger sisters. And I have them in my collection now. Mom describes very vividly the examination that all the women had to go through, an internal examination. She describes the uniform they were given, particularly the clogs, because later in the death march, she was walking in those clogs, which was agony. And the greatest thing for any survivor, and they'll tell you this, is the fact that you grouped up with somebody. If you were alone, the worst thing was to be alone. And indeed, my mother befriended another Kovno woman, Henny Aronson, and they became the closest of friends. And friendship doesn't get any better than this when you are fighting not only for your own life, but you're fighting for your friend's life as well. And they kept each other alive throughout the terrible days in the camp, as well as on the death march. And you can see that their prisoner numbers were not too far from each other. And that's how they met. And they were part of a little group. Mama joined that group of women, and they kept each other together for the most part. The men were sent to Dachau, and Dachau is in Germany, so the train ride was much further. You're familiar with the Arbeit macht frei. But in fact, the men were sent to a different work camp, Kaufering. Kaufering was a camp, a series of camps down near the city of Landsberg. And these were the Kaufering huts. And in Kaufering, the prisoners were forced to work on the Messerschmitt project. And this was, I visited there last year actually, and this is what remains of those Kaufering huts where they lived. And the Allies, when they liberated Kaufering, they took photos of what they found. It was horrifying, absolutely horrifying what they found. And going back to Stutthof, in Stutthof, my grandmother came in with the two younger daughters, and they were immediately separated and sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau. And they were sent directly to the gas chambers. From the train through the jowls of Birkenau, this is Birkenau, and they were sent to the gas chambers, and their ashes were spread here in this little lake. And when I visited, this was the place that I tried to light a candle, but as I say in the story, I tell in the story, the clouds started, the clouds came in, the wind, gale winds came in, the sky got dark. And I looked up at the sky and I said, Mom, I'm sorry, I had to come. Because that's another one of our family jokes, that I should never go back to Lithuania, to Germany, or to Poland. But I did, I had to. And that was my trip in their footsteps. And I started this trip after I found these two books. This is the history of the murders at the 7th Fort, written by a Lithuanian historian, giving all the details. And this is the story of Stutthof, what happened in Stutthof. And in fact, in this book, I found what I was looking for years. I could never find the town where my mother was liberated, because she was taken on a death march. And in this book, I found a map of the death marches. And I finally, after so many years, found the town that she called Chinov. Of course, I couldn't find Chinov on any map because that's the Yiddish pronunciation, but the town was called Chinovye. And as you can see, it's northwest of Stutthof, near Danzig, Gdansk today. And once I got that map, I set out to follow the death march. And the lady you saw, my mother's friend Henny, well, her son Steve Aronson, joined me on this occasion. So we followed the death march. We didn't walk. We had a driver and a car. And Mom described sleeping in barns. Of course, I photographed every barn that I saw along the way. She described sleeping in a church, and we actually found the church because this church in Lucino had murals to the what they called the evacuation route. We called the death march, but in Poland, it's called the evacuation route from Stutthof, because there were many, many Poles, Polish prisoners in Stutthof as well. She describes sleeping in a prison, in a jail, and she remembers it vividly because it was heated. And this was winter, by the way. And so, of course, she remembers it also not only because it was heated, but because it was heated, the lice started to work on them. So I'm cognizant of the time. I will, of course, after she was liberated by the Russians in the town of Chinov, she was almost dead. She was extremely sick with typhus. And the Russians came in, and the story between liberation and reunification is also quite amazing. And I'll show you about that. First, recuperating their health was the main thing, finding food, and there's quite a story about that. And then, of course, trying to find out who survived and who didn't. This is the first photo of my mother and her group of friends. This is my mother. This is Henny, the lady I showed you in the other photo, and their little group of friends. And here's my grandfather. Well, how did he find her? That in itself is a story for Hollywood, I'm telling you. I won't have time to tell you the details, maybe in the Q&A, but how he managed to find his family is nothing less than incredible, nothing less than incredible. And so he unified the family down in Lodz, and they still didn't know where my father, Lyova, was. Because he escaped from the ghetto, they didn't know if he survived. And until one day somebody came from Kovno, got out of Kovno, came through Lodz, and he told them, oh yeah, I saw Lyova, he's back in Kovno, yeah, he's alive. And at that moment, my mother had to make a decision. And the decision she made was to go and look for him in Kovno. And at that point already, the Russians were closing all the borders. If you didn't have papers, it was very, very dangerous for her to do that. But she decided to do it. And that in itself is an unbelievable story. And how she found him and when she found him the day before he was about to leave. So that's another one of these stories. But eventually they made their way back to Lodz. My grandparents were no longer there. They were now in Landsberg. And this is the city of Landsberg. This is what the DP camp looked like just after the war. And these are the photos. I have a whole collection of photos from the DP camp. Mom found a job in the clinic. She always wanted to be a doctor. And so this is about as close as she could come. She was a secretary at the clinic. And Papa, of course, got a job with cars and the motor pool and Jeeps. So, so he was working there, and they were basically trying to recuperate their lost years, having, traveling around. And this is the photo I chose for the cover of my book because they look so much in love, and die Liebe hat gebrannt. They were very much in love. And bingo, I was born in the DP camp in Landsberg. And this is a photo of my grandparents in the DP camp listening intently to the radio. This was the UN vote on the partition of Palestine. So they were listening intently to see what would happen. And of course, like all the other DPs, they were searching for a new home. And as I told you, my parents had relatives all over the world. So they were applying to all different places. Palestine, Israel, at that point, it was already Israel, was also a possibility. But when they heard about the the war, the fighting that was going on, and the food rationing, and they were told that with a child, it might not be a good idea to come to Israel. And so when they finally got a visa to the United States in 1950, we decided to come to the United States. This is a map of Mama's journeys. She was all over the place, and later on in her life, she continued doing these journeys. We got passage on the SS General Baloo. Papa was working in the engine room to pay our passage. Here's Etale and Mama on the ship. And of course, we came to New York Harbor. Everybody was very excited. My mother says, "Oi, Gewalt, what are we going to do now?" But they managed, and managed to live and have a good life. Mama lived to 90 years old. She could have done without the last 3 years, but Mama lived a good life afterwards, had 3 daughters, very, very close, and she got to see her 8 grandchildren. You see, she's wearing a t-shirt, Deshene Bobe, and Boba's grandkids. And she now has 5 great-grandchildren, although she couldn't live to see any of them except Ava, who I don't know that she even remembered her at that point. And one of Mama's legacies was to ensure that there was a grave site where our family could meet and mourn, because Mama always felt that she didn't have a place to mourn her family. And so she arranged for Papa's body to be brought to Israel, and she bought a plot for the 2 of them. And so they're both buried in Israel. And the full story you can read in my book. This little one here is named Zoe, Zoe after Zlata. So we have Zlata's name in memory. The book includes my reflections on being a second generation, on being a child of survivors, and about my traveling to all the places in my parents' story. So it's almost a double memoir. So basically I leave, I end my presentations with a message. My first message to all my audiences, particularly the young kids, high school kids, university kids, is interview your grandparents. I've worked in 6 countries in international schools with kids from 100 different countries. And I encourage all of them. Sometimes I gave them assignments. Interview your great-grandparents, interview your grandparents now, because when you will want to know their stories, it'll be too late. And so the stories from all over the world, every grandparent has a story, and it's important to know your heritage. And Mama's famous words are, "What doesn't kill you makes you strong." Now, I always thought this was my mother's invention. Only recently in my research, I discovered Nietzsche actually said it before her, but it still holds true. And my message is also for everybody to be active in safeguarding our democracies, that we need to speak up, speak out, and vote. So I thank you all for listening. And I'm happy, if we have time, to answer questions. Anybody?
Ettie, I just want to thank you so much. That was wonderful. Every time you hear a Holocaust story, you think, oh my God, I can't hear another one that is more interesting, more informative, more heartfelt, and this was wonderful. And I also want to tell you that at our Holocaust Museum, Los Angeles, we have a very active 2G group. So we do also take your thoughts and lessons about knowing about the Holocaust, about passing along these memories from generation to generation. So that's very, very important.
Thank you.
Any questions for you? But I want to tell you who won your book. Eliza de Sola Mendez, Pam Bognar, and Betsy Eigenberg. Congratulations to all of you. We will be in contact via email to arrange sending you your copy of the wonderful book. As I end today's program, I invite you to join us for a Holocaust survivor speech from our Holocaust Museum. We have Erica Fabian tomorrow, December 23rd at 11 o'clock. And next week on Wednesday, December 30th at 11, we will host a public virtual tour. So you are staying busy during this holiday season, Ettie, and I wish you the best for a new, less crazy year. You can find more important messages about our virtual events on our website at holocaustmuseumla.org. Thank you again for joining us today. Take care. We hope to see you soon. Best wishes for a healthy and happy new year.